but when I go to record. Okay, here we go. Let's try it out. Ooh, that's loud. Turn it down a little bit. Turn it. There we go. All right, we're going to get down to business here. And in this lecture, we are going to talk about four different but similar empires in what we now consider the Middle East, Asia, and Eurasia. Our class is world history, but so far we've mostly focused on the Western world. Today we're going to bring a little bit of balance. Not enough, to be honest, but we'll at least get a sense of what's going on in the rest of the world. And this was ideally supposed to be before the East Asian lecture, but technical difficulties, here we are. But we're still trying to bring a sense of balance to the world. Now, we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, and the beginnings of Russia. The Ottomans and Russia are going to go a lot further than what we're going to explore today, but just to kind of give you a heads up of where we're going, let's take a look at the map that I've placed here. Now, it's not the best map. I just kind of Googled for this last minute, and not really. When I first set this up, it was last minute. I should have gone back to get it. All right, we're going to look at this map here. It is not the best resolution, but it still gives you kind of a good idea of where these empires are. Russia, surprise, it's in Russia, modern day Russia. The Safavids, their heart is going to be what's now Iran, but they are very extensive into other countries, other modern day countries as well. The Mughal Empire is mostly concentrated around the subcontinent of India. The Ottoman Empire, all over what we now call the Middle East, including northern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And we talk in the East Asia lecture about the Qing Empire under the Manchu, after the Manchu invasion, and that kind of gives you a sense of where all these where all these empires are kind of moving around this part of the world. The lines, if you can't quite tell, that's like the extent, the greatest extent that they had at the 16th through the 18th centuries. All right, for each of these questions, for each of these empires, we are going to ask a few questions. So some of the questions to ask for each, I'm not going to have this slide on every lecture, but just something to keep in mind. Who founded the empire? Who were some of their important leaders? Where did they occupy? What lands did they occupy? Where were they? What was their center of power? How did this empire affect the people within it? How did it operate? And then what led to its downfall or collapse, if relevant for this particular lecture? So like I mentioned, the Ottomans, the Russians, they're going to keep going on for quite a while. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at our first empire, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire dates back to the early 1300s, so well before our class period starts. And it goes beyond 1750, but for this lecture, we're just going to focus on this time, 1300 to 1750. The Ottomans claimed what is now modern-day Turkey, but again, we saw from the map a very vast claim, but the center is always going to be kind of what's now modern-day Turkey. The founder of the Ottoman Empire and the man who it's named for is a guy named Osman. Now, Osman was a military leader, and there is a treasured Ottoman legend that he had a dream where he envisioned a tree growing out of his navel. The branches spread throughout the world, and he asked a Sufi sheikh to interpret the vision. And the Sufi sheikh told him that this dream meant that he would be the founder of a huge empire with many peoples under his sovereignty, and that this empire would encompass large territories and would bring much glory to the house of Osman and to Islam in general. So how does Osman make an empire? He's going to do this through the use of the military. And that's going to be kind of the theme for the Ottomans. They were a war machine. If this were Game of Thrones, they would be the Dothraki, if you're familiar with that show. Some of the key leaders here. Murad I, who, again, outside the scope of our course, was important towards creating the Janissaries, and again, I'm going to talk about those in a little bit. Hugely important, Mehmed the Conqueror and Suleiman the Magnificent. Thankfully, their nicknames tell us about them. Mehmed started out when his dad abdicated the throne, but it didn't last because he was so young. Well, he got a second chance and he didn't squander it. He needed to make like a bold move, and so he decided to go for conquest. Now, Mehmed turned his eyes to Constantinople. Constantinople represented imperial power and global success. It had been the second Rome. It was the centerpiece of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years. It was named for Constantine, the guy whose conversion to Christianity changed world history in the early part of world history. Mehmed had studied military tactics, and he just pored over books, he consulted with advisors, and he set his eyes on capturing Constantinople. And the way he did this was he built up a huge fortress and used an old Ottoman fortress and basically cut off all access to Constantinople. His army was huge. It had like 100,000 people in it, including the well-trained Janissaries. And he studied this military stuff to the point of obsession. And he also had technology on his side. He had the world's largest cannon. In fact, it was so big. It had like a 23-foot barrel. And it was so big, it would get so hot that they could only fire it like once or twice a day. Its blast could be heard for up to 10 miles away. Now, we didn't talk much about this with the Columbian Exchange lecture, but the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople was one of the reasons that Western European Christian countries like Portugal started looking for a sea route to Asia. It was one of the key reasons that Western European Christian countries like Portugal started looking for a sea route to India rather than an overland route. Now, despite the conquest, Mehmed sought to make Istanbul a cosmopolitan city. He had some religious toleration to an extent. He surrounded himself with Byzantine historians, philosophers, writers, and diplomats. He was interested in many of the things that his contemporaries in Europe were interested in. He was an Ottoman Renaissance man, as one of the historians I've consulted has called him. Now let's talk about Suleiman the Magnificent for a minute, and I want to give you a visual here. Suleiman, there he is. So Suleiman took the throne in the time period that our class takes place in, ruling from 1522 to 1566. Now, by the 1500s, the Ottomans are well established as an empire. Suleiman saw himself as a major player in this world and set out to prove it. Taking the throne at age 26, he immediately launched his first military campaign. Suleiman's army, led by the Janissaries, pushed deep into the heart of Europe. The city of Belgrade fell, and Suleiman's navy captured the island of Rhodes. Rhodes is where one of the great wonders of the ancient world stood, the Colossus of Rhodes. Suleiman kept on the attack. In 1526, his army first entered and sacked the Hungarian capital of Buda. 3 years later, his troops pushed all the way to the gates of Vienna. And you probably don't recall this, but back during the Protestant Reformation lecture, we talked about how the Holy Roman Emperor was like, okay, we're going to take a time out for this because I've got to deal with these Ottomans at the doors of Vienna. That was I think, Charles V. That's what's going on. That's what's going on. Suleiman built up his navy with the help of a guy named Barbarossa, who was also known as a pirate, who sought control of trade in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Suleiman also wanted to project strength through architecture. He called on a janissary named Mimar Sinan to create mosques and public buildings throughout the empire. Sinan was trained as a military engineer. He built arsenals, he built bridges, aqueducts, and he proved to be an architectural genius. Over a 40-year period, he designed and built 79 mosques, 39 palaces, 19 tombs, and more than 60 other significant monuments and buildings. From a governing standpoint, Suleiman was incredibly important. Suleiman developed a legal system based on precedent and case law. That's the same kind of legal system we have. I mean, it's not the same as the Ottomans, but the idea of case law and precedent. That was the system of law was also consistent with the sacred law of Islam. He also insisted that all new laws be compatible with Western Christian tradition. Now, Suleiman is known as the lawgiver because he presided over an unprecedented codification of law. In fact, it might be hard to believe, given the United States' relationship with the Islamic world in the 21st century, but the United States House of Representatives chamber includes this bas-relief portrait of Suleiman, the one that's on the screen right now. The chamber is surrounded by portraits of lawgivers, beginning with Moses and ending with Thomas Jefferson, the father of the Declaration of Independence, and George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights. Suleiman is included because he was one of the most important lawgivers in world history. His reign is seen as the golden age of the Ottomans, and Suleiman, like his predecessors, was assisted in his rule thanks to the military might of the Janissaries. Now, the Janissaries, the way this army worked starting out was pretty scary. Ottoman officials would descend upon towns in Christian territories that they had defeated. They would order all the young boys of the village to come forth for inspection. And villagers, they would, hide their kids, hide their wives, because the villagers would put a few kids on display, but they really wanted to keep their kids safe away from these Ottoman officials. Anyway, but the Ottoman officials would go through, they would inspect these kids, and they would kind of arrange them by height, weight, proportions, and they would select the ones that they thought would be best for a military career and took them with them. Now, the kids who are taken, they are basically enslaved, but again, this is old world slavery. It is a kind of temporary form of slavery. I'm not excusing it, I'm just making the distinction here. Anyway, new recruits were brought to the Ottoman capital. They were converted to Islam, and they underwent intense physical training. They were drilled in the arts of war. There was physical training that included both weightlifting and wrestling, and they also practiced various military formations. There's archery practice. The Ottomans were very skilled archers. Now, there was some resistance at first. Like I said, parents are hiding their kids. They start to arrange childhood marriages. But then families realized how prestigious this path could be. They knew that a promising career could happen through the Janissary system. And indeed, not few of the more successful recruits. Indeed, a few of the more successful recruits into the system later became very important high-ranking officials in the Ottoman state. The strongest and brightest were sent to special schools to finish their education. Janissaries who entered the palace schools got a very broad education. They were trained in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and they certainly were trained in the Islamic sciences. Everyone was taught a skill, and the more extraordinary were rewarded in life with transfers from military service to civil service. A select few became part of the Sultan's inner palace circle. Counselors and viziers, V-I-Z-I-E-R-S, counselors and viziers quietly ran the government. Others were returned to their homelands as administrators. In fact, they became deputies of the Sultan's royal family. So essentially, the Janissaries weren't just the army, but they provided a key part of the Ottoman Empire bureaucracy. I want to move on to talk a little bit about the bureaucracy here. The Janissaries, who were among the senior-most, could be hired in the administration of governance and were in charge of maintaining order, collecting taxes, and keeping track of supplies. This was a well-organized war machine. Some Janissaries, the most talented, might become Grand Vizier. The Grand Vizier was the closest advisor to the Sultan. In reality, the Grand Vizier did a lot of the running of the empire. The Grand Vizier was in some sense like a prime minister compared to the Sultan, who was like a king. In the later Ottoman Empire, the Grand Vizier really will be running things. Another key component to the empire's rule was the harem. Now, in the Western world, we tend to think of the harem as this pleasure den of the ruler, and really it was somewhat of that, but it was really an institution in which the reproduction of the Ottoman dynasty was planned and enforced. Harem women were often Christian slaves taken as prisoners of war or brought to the palace by government officials seeking favors. The Ottoman sultans and their concubines followed a very particular policy, by which each concubine could have only one son. The minute she's produced a son, she no longer sleeps with the sultan. The idea was that no two princes should be, quote, disadvantaged by having to share a mother. In other words, every prince deserves his own mother. The word harem means forbidden, and the sultan's harem was housed in a beautiful but very restricted complex within a place called Topkapi Palace. Topkapi is spelled Topkapi. Now, the women who were chosen for their beauty were converted to Islam and schooled in the Quran. Their role was to tend to the sultan and bear his children. They were often attractive. Many of them were taught singing, sometimes musical instruments. At its height, over 1,000 women lived in the harem, but few actually slept with the sultan. Those who did could rise up in society and exert influence on the sultan. There was a very strict hierarchy within the group. The most beautiful and highly trained women were allowed to sleep with the sultan once. Among those who bore him a son, they became his favorites. These were the closest that a sultan would have to having a traditional marriage. As the size and influence of the Ottoman Empire grew, stories of concubines and the sultan's private harem spread. European writers spun lurid tales of beautiful naked women, fueling the myths of debauchery. Well, this fantasy of the sultan surrounded by naked women probably really didn't happen, but there were definitely maybe a few for whom that was the reality. Now, Islamic law recognizes the reproduction with concubines as a legitimate phenomenon. A man could take a female slave as a sex partner if she was willing. And then if he has children by her, those children are legitimate if he acknowledges them as his own. Well, there's this Ukrainian slave girl named Roxolana who became a favorite of Suleiman. She actually became his great love. And very, very special things are done for her. He actually breaks a number of customs or traditions for her. The Sultan sold all his concubines as virgins and committed to an unprecedented monogamous relationship with Roxolana. She produced 6 children with him. And people didn't quite understand why the Sultan was having so many children with her and why he's honoring her. And they start to think that she is, using her wiles against him, that maybe she's a witch. In 1534, Suleiman made a highly controversial choice. He and Roxolana were officially married. And according to the accounts of the time, we don't have any images of her, but according to accounts of the time, Roxolana was not the extraordinary beauty that some concubines had been. And so this really inspires a lot of speculation that she might have had training in the arts of enchantment, and that's what enabled her to capture the Sultan's heart in so vigorous a fashion. Well, whatever her wiles or whatever, maybe it was just love, I don't know, it's a hard thing to imagine. Roxolana became a powerful force in the empire. She was smart, she was very, very knowledgeable about political intrigue, and we know that she got involved in palace politics. Some scholars even argue and believe that she played a role in the killing of Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa, and made place for her own sons. Now, Suleiman accepted rumors that Mustafa was planning to overthrow him, and he had Mustafa executed. This was a devastating thing to have to do. Roxolana got blamed for this. She is one of the people who said to Suleiman, Mustafa's trying to get rid of you. And after Mustafa's execution, Roxolana's own son died under mysterious circumstances, leaving Roxolana's favorite son, Selim, as the only surviving heir, or Selim, leaving Roxolana's favorite son, Selim, as the only surviving heir. I mean, we are talking about Ottoman palace politics. You have to be smart, you have to be calculating, you have to be vicious in order to survive. And Roxolana was sometimes seen as a manipulative woman, but you kind of have to be manipulative in order to survive in that environment. Suleiman's loyalty to his wife never wavered. In fact, when she died, she was buried in a tomb designed for a queen. Now, the Janissaries became more important and much larger of a force, which meant they had to be paid, and they're expensive. Now, at the same time, the silver mines in Potosi and other places in the New World are flooding the silver market and creating inflation, which is going to bankrupt landholders. And in an environmental crisis, the Little Ice Age, revolts broke out. Former landholding cavalrymen, short term soldiers who were released at the end of campaigns, and peasants overburdened by taxes and many other impoverished people formed into bands of marauders throughout Anatolia, which is today's Turkey. The Janissary revolts, especially the one led by Patrona Halil, demonstrated that there was significant decay at the center of the empire, although the empire would continue to last up until World War I. Now, many people did not feel the threat or see Europe as the enemy that would take down the empire. Suleiman was heavily influenced by European design, evidenced in the art and architecture that he pursued. In fact, in the bottom corner, that looks like, I don't know, some castle out of a fairy book or something, like fairy tale or something, but that is actually in the Ottoman Empire. It is the gate of a palace. Actually, that's the gate to Topkapi Palace. In Istanbul, Suleiman launched a cultural and architectural revival to match that of the European Renaissance. Topkapi Palace was refashioned in the grand style of a European king. The court adopted the ceremonial style of European royalty. Later, Istanbul elite experimented with European clothing and furniture styles and purchased printed books from the empire's first printing press. The Tulip period, towards the end of Ahmed III's reign, saw European styles and attitudes becoming more popular. And it's called the Tulip period because of the craze for high-priced tulip bulbs. There was a similar phenomenon going on in the Netherlands when the tulip was introduced there from Istanbul in the mid-1500s. All told, the Ottomans, at their peak in this context of the lecture, ruled extensive territory of about 2 million square miles and 30 million diverse people. And we're going to kind of put a pin on the Ottomans. We'll pick up with them again later on in the course. And our next lecture, we're going to look at the Safavid Empire.